The imperial guards would one day find Sporus trembling in a cellar, clutching poison in his hand, ready to choose death rather than endure what Rome had prepared for him. But to understand why a boy of barely 20 would long for death more than life, we must begin 3 years earlier, in the moment when an emperor's grief shattered the boundaries of reason. Rome, 65 AD. The most powerful man in the world, Emperor Nero, had just killed the woman he loved most. Not in war, not by decree of execution, but with his own hands. Poppaea Sabina, pregnant, adored, envied, lay dead on the marble floor of their private chamber. The sources disagree on the exact moment of her death. Some say a single devastating kick to her swollen belly ended both her life and that of her unborn child. Others speak of a violent outburst, a beating that left her bleeding until she collapsed in agony. Whatever the details, one fact is certain: Rome's empress was gone, and the emperor himself was her killer. But Sabina was not just another imperial wife. She was Nero's obsession, his muse, the embodiment of everything he desired. Roman poets compared her amber hair to molten gold, her skin to ivory polished by the gods, and her enormous eyes to Venus herself. She was elegance personified, able to charm senators and captivate crowds. To Nero, raised in a court that constantly reminded him of his divine bloodline, she was the one mortal who reflected back his own grandeur. Her sudden death did not produce the grief of an ordinary man. It sparked the unraveling of someone who believed the universe itself bent to his will. To Nero, this loss was not just personal, it was a cosmic insult. A boundary dared to stand where he recognized no boundaries. Roman tradition demanded cremation for the dead, accompanied by solemn public rituals that reminded citizens of life's fleeting nature. But Nero rejected all of it. He ordered her body embalmed with more spices than Arabia produced in a year, entombed in a crystal sarcophagus, dressed in her finest silks and jewels. He would not let her decay, not let her go. Palace servants whispered of the emperor setting places for her at dinner, conversing with her embalmed body as though she still counseled him on affairs of state. He would wander the halls at night crying her name, demanding physicians find a way to undo death itself. In a Rome where death was constant and expected from childbirth, war, plague, Nero's refusal to accept mortality was shocking. To many it seemed as though the emperor no longer mourned a wife, but fought a war against nature itself. Soon his madness bled into daily life. Food lost its taste unless prepared exactly as Sabina had liked it. Her chambers remained preserved down to the position of a brush on the table. He surrounded himself with painters and sculptors, ordering them to capture not just her likeness but her soul, and when their marble and pigments inevitably failed, he lashed out with rage or crumbled into sobs, like a child whose toy had been stolen. 2 months after her death, the hallucinations began. At banquets, in the theatre, even during state meetings, Nero would suddenly stop speaking, transfixed by the sight of some woman in the crowd whose face carried a fleeting resemblance to Sabina's. He grabbed slaves by the chin, staring desperately into their eyes, searching for what had been taken from him. He saw her everywhere, in everyone. The court held its breath. Was this grief that would pass? Or had the emperor's mind fractured beyond repair? Few dared to ask aloud, but all understood that a ruler who believed he could defy death was capable of anything. And then, one ordinary day, amid the monotony of reviewing administrative scrolls, the emperor looked up and saw a young boy, a palace-born servant who would change everything. The boy's name was Sporus. Born within the palace household, he had grown up in a world where the emperor's shadow determined the fate of every servant. He was not a senator's son, nor a general's heir, but a page trained in manners, taught to read poetry, instructed in the delicate arts of pouring wine and speaking only when spoken to. His destiny should have been quiet obedience, fading into history like countless nameless attendants before him. But fate, or perhaps Nero's madness, decided otherwise. One afternoon, as Nero sifted through documents with the senators, his gaze fell upon the boy. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight struck Sporus's face, the shape of his eyes, or the tilt of his jawline. Whatever it was, Nero froze, transfixed. He whispered to those beside him that he had seen Sabina returned from the grave. From that moment, Sporus ceased to be himself. To Nero, he was not Sporus at all, he was Poppaea Sabina reborn. The emperor demanded that the boy stand before him. He circled him like a sculptor studying raw marble, running his hand across Sporus's cheek, murmuring that Venus herself had given him back what death had stolen. His courtiers, those who once might have laughed or protested, knew better than to speak. In Rome, survival often meant silence. The transformation began immediately. Nero forbade Sporus from using his own name. Instead, he was to answer only to Sabina. He was dressed in silks once worn by the late Empress, his hair styled in the same elaborate curls, his gestures drilled until they mimicked hers with eerie perfection. It was not enough for Sporus to look like Poppaea, he had to become her. At banquets, Nero would command him to sit at his side, feeding him lines to recite, jokes to deliver, even the exact tone with which Sabina used to laugh. Servants trained him to walk with the graceful sway of a Roman matron, to lower his gaze as Poppaea had done when pretending to be modest, to use her favourite perfume so that her scent seemed to drift through the palace once more. For Sporus, the transformation was suffocating. Each day, his reflection in polished bronze grew less recognisable. The name his mother had given him, the voice that was his own, the gestures he had learned as a child all stripped away, overwritten by the emperor's obsession. He was being erased, piece by piece. But Nero was not satisfied with illusions. A wig, a dress, and rehearsed mannerisms could fool a crowd from afar, but the emperor wanted more. He wanted Sabina's body itself resurrected. And in Rome, where medicine was crude and surgery often a death sentence, Nero summoned his physicians and ordered the unthinkable. The boy would be cut, altered, remade. This was not a suggestion. In the Roman court, the emperor's command was law, even when it defied reason, nature, or morality. The physicians protested in whispers, warning of agony, infection, and perhaps death. But to refuse Nero was a greater danger than any wound. And so the plans for Sporus's transformation were drawn. The physicians gathered in the dim chambers of the Palatine Palace, their faces pale with dread. For all their years of practice, they were not healers in this moment. They were executioners of innocence, forced to carry out the emperor's madness. The boy was brought in. His wrists trembled, his lips colourless. He could not protest. Even if he had screamed, it would have echoed into nothingness. No one defied Nero and lived. The Roman world knew of mutilation, slaves were branded, criminals disfigured, but this was something else entirely. Nero's command was precise. Sporus must be altered to resemble a woman, and so the surgeons cut. There were no anesthetics in ancient Rome, only crude opiates and strong wine. The boy's screams shook the chamber, echoing through the marble halls, until his voice gave way to hoarse sobs. Blood stained the floors, carried away in bronze basins. Physicians worked with trembling hands, knowing that too much hesitation would anger the emperor, yet too much haste might kill the patient before the resurrection was complete. When it was done, Sporus lay half-conscious, his body forever changed. He was no longer whole, his manhood had been taken, his body reshaped into something neither male nor female, but a grotesque imitation demanded by power. Nero, however, did not see the horror. He saw victory. For days, the emperor visited Sporus's chambers, hovering at his bedside like a grieving widower finally reunited with his love. He stroked the boy's hair, whispering to him as though Sabina's soul had returned. "Rest now, my Sabina," he murmured. "You have come back to me." The palace adapted to its emperor's delusion. Servants were ordered to address Sporus as Augusta, the title of an empress. Seamstresses dressed him in gowns tailored from Sabina's old garments, fitting them to his wounded frame. Gold bracelets clinked against his thin wrists. He was doused in oils of myrrh and rose, until the very air seemed to carry Poppaea's ghostly fragrance. But Sporus himself was silent. His laughter, once bright, was gone, his voice reduced to whispers when forced to speak. He avoided mirrors, for the image that stared back was no longer a boy, nor the woman he was meant to replace, but a stranger trapped between two worlds. The first test came at a private banquet. Nero unveiled him before a circle of Rome's most powerful men, senators, generals, poets. The hall went silent as the boy entered, veiled in saffron silk, walking with trembling steps rehearsed again and again until his body remembered the movements even as his mind resisted. Nero rose to his feet and announced, "Behold, my Sabina returned to me." The courtiers, well trained in survival, applauded. They toasted the emperor, pretending not to notice the boy's downcast eyes, the way his hands shook as he lifted a goblet of wine. In that moment, silence became complicity. None dared whisper the truth that this was not resurrection, but desecration. To Nero, however, the illusion was complete. He smiled with the triumph of a man who believed he had conquered death itself. And for Sporus, the nightmare was only beginning. In the year 67 AD, Rome witnessed a spectacle that blurred the line between tragedy and farce. Emperor Nero announced that he would marry again. But the bride was no senator's daughter, no foreign princess meant to strengthen alliances. The bride was Sporus, the boy whom he had carved into the image of Poppaea Sabina. The city buzzed with rumors. Some whispered that it was blasphemy, others that it was madness, but none dared speak openly. In Rome, survival meant not questioning the emperor's desires. The wedding was conducted with full imperial pomp. Sporus was dressed in the traditional saffron veil of a Roman bride, the flammeum which covered his face in a cascade of orange silk. He wore a bridal crown of flowers and a belt tied with the knot of Hercules, a symbol meant to be untied only on the wedding night. Courtiers carried torches, musicians played flutes, and poets prepared verses to honor the grotesque union. Before the gods and the people of Rome, Nero took Sporus's hand and declared him his wife. The crowd cheered because they had to. Senators raised their goblets in praise, pretending not to see the hollow emptiness in the bride's eyes. From that day onward, Sporus was no longer presented as a servant or even a consort. He was the Empress of Rome. He appeared beside Nero at gladiatorial games, dressed in embroidered gowns, his neck adorned with jewels that had once belonged to Poppaea. He was paraded at festivals and ceremonies, seated in a golden litter carried through the streets so that the people might gaze upon the resurrected Sabina. On Nero's tour of Greece, Sporus accompanied him, introduced to foreign dignitaries as his wife, his Augusta. But beneath the layers of silk and perfume was a boy trapped in silence. Every gesture he made, every smile he forced, every word he spoke had to echo Poppaea's memory. He was not allowed to exist as himself, only as the echo of a dead woman. At night, in the privacy of the palace, the nightmare deepened. Nero expected not only the performance of a wife, but of Poppaea herself. He would whisper to Sporus as if he were speaking to the woman he had killed, demanding the same tone of voice, the same words of affection, the same presence in bed. For Sporus, every night was a theatre he could not escape. Over time, the boy's sense of self began to fracture. Servants whispered of finding him staring at mirrors, touching his face as though trying to remember who he had once been. Sometimes he spoke to his reflection in the voice of Poppaea, only to break down moments later, clawing at his hair, whispering his true name under his breath as if to remind himself that he had not yet vanished entirely. And yet, the empire carried on. The Senate pretended, the poets praised, the people gossiped, but no one intervened. The emperor's will was law, and in the silence of a complicit society, Sporus's erasure became complete. To Nero, he had achieved the impossible. He had conquered death. Poppaea walked beside him once more, dressed in silk, smiling at the crowds, sitting in the imperial box at the circus. But history was already moving against him. Outside the golden halls, rebellion stirred, and Rome itself would soon turn against the emperor, who believed he could command even the gods. By 68 AD, the illusion of Nero's eternal reign was collapsing. Across the empire, rebellion flared like wildfire. The legions in Gaul, Spain, and Africa declared loyalty to rival generals. The Senate whispered treason in their marble halls. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, abandoned him once the tide began to turn. Nero, who had once commanded the largest empire on earth, now found himself a fugitive. In his final days, only a handful of loyal freedmen and one spectral figure remained by his side, Sporus. To the end, the boy was forced to play his role. As Nero wept and raged over the betrayal of Rome, he clung to Sporus, calling him Sabina, begging him to stay close, as though the boy's presence alone could shield him from the collapse of his world. They fled together to a villa on the outskirts of the city. There, as the Senate declared him a public enemy and soldiers closed in, Nero faced the reality he had long denied. He was mortal, and his death was inevitable. Yet even in this final hour, he staged his own end like a performance. Trembling, he asked Sporus to mourn him as a wife, to weep for him as Poppaea once had. Then, when the soldiers approached, Nero pressed a dagger to his throat. Unable to finish the act, he begged one of his freedmen to guide his hand. With a final cry, "What an artist dies in me!" the emperor's life ended. Sporus was left alive, standing over the corpse of the man who had destroyed and remade him. But survival was not mercy. The boy, now around 18 years old, became a living relic of Nero's madness. When Galba took the throne, he treated Sporus with cold detachment, seeing in him only a symbol of decadence. Otho, the next emperor, was something stranger still. He had once been married to Poppaea before Nero stole her away. Seeing Sporus dressed in her silks, he too began to treat the boy as though he were the widow of an emperor, as though Sabina had been returned once again. To the Roman elite, Sporus was no longer a person. He was an object, a shadow, a grotesque reminder of the late emperor's obsessions. Passed from hand to hand, he carried the echo of Poppaea's beauty, but none of her power. And soon, he would encounter the cruelest fate of all, for the throne of Rome was never steady. In 69 AD, the infamous year of the four emperors, a brutal soldier named Vitellius seized power. And when his gaze fell upon Sporus, he saw not a person, nor even a bride, but entertainment. Vitellius was not a man of refinement like Nero fancied himself to be. He was crude, gluttonous, and cruel. A soldier raised to emperor by force of arms, with little patience for art or philosophy. But when Sporus was brought before him, dressed still in the silks of an empress, Vitellius's imagination lit with a different kind of cruelty. He announced his intention to make Sporus the star of a public spectacle. The boy would play the role of Proserpina, the goddess who was seized and dragged into the underworld by Pluto. It would not be theatre. It would be a staged rape before the eyes of Rome, a grotesque parody of myth where Sporus's suffering would serve as entertainment for the masses. The court laughed. The senators smirked. Rome, which had tolerated and applauded his humiliation as Nero's wife, now prepared to watch him degraded further. But Sporus understood what awaited him. He had lived through enough to know that his body was no longer his own, that every moment of his existence had been written by others. Yet in this final act, he seized a choice that was still his, whether to meet the arena in chains or deny them their spectacle. Some say he drank poison. Others whisper that he slit his own veins, the same Roman death granted to disgraced nobles. However it happened, one thing is certain. Sporus died before Vitellius could parade him to the jeering crowds. He was no more than 20 years old. Thus ended the life of a boy who never truly belonged to himself. For history, Sporus is often remembered as a footnote to Nero's madness, a bizarre curiosity in the annals of Roman cruelty. But look closer, and his story reveals something deeper: the terrifying power of obsession, the erasure of identity under tyranny, and the silence of a society that chose complicity over compassion. When Rome's senators applauded Nero's wedding, when servants bowed to the empress, when poets praised the grotesque resurrection of Poppaea, they all became part of the crime. It was not only one man's madness, but the empire's collective willingness to pretend. Today, the ruins of Nero's palace still stand, its broken walls echoing with the ghosts of voices long silenced. Among them, perhaps, lingers the shadow of a boy who was forced to be someone he never was, a boy who chose death over spectacle, a victim, not of the gods, but of men.